Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Dave Sands. Welcome to the Food Origins Podcast. I'll be talking to people about their unique stories with food. And as a quick reminder, the restaurants and gear talked about on each episode can be found on my website, foodoriginspodcast.com. I appreciate your support. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Food Origins Podcast. My guest today is Timothy Koide. Tim is of Japanese and Caucasian descent and was born in Berkeley, California, and spent most of his childhood on the East Coast. Tim is currently the CEO of Seisuke Knife, company which introduces Japanese culture and traditional craftsmanship to customers by selling high-end quality Japanese knives. Tim and I connected through an event put on by Seisuke Knife, and shout out to Chef 2 and Yu Kurosaki, who came from Japan, who is Japan's youngest master bladesmith, blacksmith. And we talk about Tim's mission also that took him to Japan for 2 years. And then we also dive into his current work with Seisuke and also some of the classic restaurants in the United States. Really enjoy this conversation. Tim is an awesome storyteller. Appreciate you listening. Thanks for your support. All right, we're on. We're rolling.
Awesome.
Appreciate you coming on. We've got Timothy Koide from Seisuke Knife. He is the current CEO of the company. And, we got a shout out to Chef 2 for putting us together.
Right.
We were at Tim's event a couple weeks ago, and that's how we got connected. And I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanps for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And, we'll jump right into it. Why don't you, tell us where you're from and give us a little history about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been, I guess, back in the Bay Area here for the last 10 years or so, but I grew up primarily on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, but the family is a Bay Area family. So I was born in Berkeley. My dad was born in Berkeley. My grandpa was born in Berkeley. So long history. This actually marks the 100th anniversary of the Koides being in the Bay Area. So my great grandparents immigrated from Japan 100 years ago.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah, but we moved from the Bay Area when I was 4 years old, and we moved to the East Coast, and so I kind of grew up appreciating my heritage and kind of our family history from afar. We'd spend the summers in California, but I had a very different childhood than my dad and my grandpa did, for sure. Kind of growing up away from I guess the core of the Japanese American community here on the West Coast. And so I grew up around Amish communities and little tiny university town, State College in Pennsylvania, where all my friends growing up were white, and so whatever kind of cultural exposure I had to my family histories, culture, or heritage came as a result of visiting family as a kid growing up in the summers. But and then after I graduated from high school, I went to college in Utah at BYU. And then after my freshman year at BYU, I served a mission for my church for 2 years in the Tokyo area. And that's how I was first really kind of fully exposed to Japanese culture and learned the language as a result, and kind of the best, prior to being married and having a kid, the best 2 years of my life. But as a result of that experience too, growing up, my mom was always a pretty good cook relative to my friends' parents. And so I was raised, I guess, to a certain extent, appreciating decent food. But my mom is white, so we never really ate that much by way of Asian cuisine or Japanese cuisine, more specifically. So my 2 years in Japan was also my first kind of exposure head on to Japanese cuisine. And that was really great because up until that point, my kind of experience with Japanese food was, again, visiting family. And so it was always a treat. And so here I was living in Japan and having the opportunity to eat Japanese food on a daily basis for every meal. I mean, it felt like I was having a treat every meal, kind of a thing. Kind of reminds me of that scene in the movie Three Amigos when they're down in Mexico and they're all sitting at the table, and I think it was Chevy Chase's character, and he looks around and he goes, "This is great, but do you have anything other than Mexican food?" But just being exposed on a daily basis to Japanese food, I was just kind of, I was loving it.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into your mission. But what did you eat growing up then?
Yeah, I mean, my mom, I think her kind of, the menus, my mom's a very organized person. And I actually was just having this conversation with her the other day where as a little kid, before I went to school, I remember Monday mornings, my mom would get out. She had this little yellow card box, for index cards that she kept recipes in. And she would get that little box out, put it on the kitchen table, and start putting together a menu for the week. And then she would get out her ruler and she would get out a piece of lined paper and she would draw a calendar and she would write out her menu. This is back in the 80s, so before we would just produce this on the computer. But and she would write out the menu for the week, and that would become her shopping list. And but I think she was largely the product of kind of that post-war environment she grew up in. So we ate a lot of the the casseroles and the very kind of whitewashed chicken enchiladas, things like this, the meals that Betty Crocker put together to feed a big family, kind of a thing, in an economical way. And so we ate a lot of that. But then later on in my life, she went on a kind of a cruise with her best friend and then spent 3 weeks at a cooking school in Sicily. And so that
nice.
kind of transformed the way that she cooked and the way that she looked at the kitchen. I think the thing with cooking, right, is if you see it as a necessity, then you cook just what makes sense. And it may or may not taste good, but it's a certain mentality. When you find the joy of cooking, whether or not you're on a budget or you have no budget, but if you find that joy of cooking, it really does. You hear a lot of these like old grandmas on these food shows or whatever that talk about, putting love into the food or whatever. And it just sounds so abstract. But I think there really is something to that. Like when you find the joy for cooking.
Yeah. I mean, Julia Child definitely.
Yeah. That was the title of her book, right? Yeah. And it really does kind of change. So that changed my mom's, I think, mentality in the kitchen, where she saw it no longer as something just to feed the family, but something she actually really did enjoy because she does enjoy it. And so that kind of upped her game. So then we got a little bit more of the Mediterranean influence later on growing up. But, primarily my early childhood, it was, I think, what a lot of American families were eating in the 80s, early 90s. It was the Betty Crocker influence. So.
And you said, we talked a little bit before, get to know each other a little bit more, but you said your grandparents owned a grocery store. Is that right?
Yeah, my great-grandparents, so they immigrated, like I said, 100 years ago. And I think like a lot of immigrant stories, they were just looking for a way to get a foothold in this new country. And so they didn't have any particular attachment to food or retail or whatever. My great grandfather, the Koide family, they were historically rice farmers, but my great grandfather had no ambitions to pursue that career path. And then my great grandmother's family, I mean, they were a samurai family. So the retail thing was, I think it was just a way to make money that made sense. So they acquired a little grocery store on Ward Street in Berkeley, West Berkeley, and I think it was called Ward Cash Grocery when they bought it, and then they changed it to Koide Grocery. But they ran that from the 1930s through 1960 or 61 is when it closed. So when my dad was a little kid. But yeah, and my grandfather would tell me stories of in the middle of the Depression, they had a grocery store. So middle of the Depression, before the war, he was able to go down to the grocery because the house was right behind the grocery store. He would walk down the steps into the store and pull a pork chop out of the, butcher box, or whatever, and take it back up to the kitchen and fry it up or whatever. So they ate pretty well. Yeah, even in the midst of the Depression, I think. But yeah, so that's what they did for about 30 years.
Yeah. Really cool. And then your ethnicity obviously is Japanese, and then what's the other side?
Yeah, so my mom's side is mainly Irish Dutch.
Yeah.
Maternal grandmother comes from an Irish family, and then grandfather is primarily a Dutch family. And so food in my grandparents' home, again, on that side was, it's every Norman Rockwell painting you've ever seen of a dinner table, just kind of very typical American fare, whatever that means. But
and then did you guys do some stuff in the Central Valley as well, like fruit with the fruit picking?
Yeah. So my paternal grandmother, my dad's mom, she was born in Orange County, and like a lot of Japanese American families, they were involved in the agricultural industry as pickers. I mean, they were out in the field, the berry fields, picking strawberries, and then they went back to Japan for a few years in the 30s, and when they came back to the Central Valley, to a little town called Lindsay. And my great-grandfather came back to be the principal of a Japanese school there, but that really didn't pay anything, so they kept picking fruit. And my grandmother, I can't remember if it was my grandma or my great-uncle, would tell this story of they were picking raisin grapes. And in those days, a lot of raisin grapes still are sun-dried, but they'd pick these raisin grapes and they'd lay them out on mats in the fields, and that's how they would dry them. And you can imagine typical immigrant labor kind of experience, but the foremen of the fields were not the nicest guys in the world. And so these little Japanese boys, to kind of get back on them, they would have these raisin grapes laying out, drying in the field, and these kids just unzip their flies and just peed all over the raisin grapes while they're dry. So somewhere back in the 1930s, there were some lucky people who got boxes of raisins that had the dried urine of
oh my God, some
these young Japanese boys.
Naughty boys.
Yeah.
Wow. That's funny.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you're not nice.
That's right.
And then, kind of go into, growing up, but like did that kind of the agricultural stuff, did that pique your interest? Cause I know you ended up doing a lot of
so
studying and working with agriculture, right?
Yeah, well, not so much on the study side. I built, my first startup was in ag. And that was heavily influenced by the family experience. My dad is a professor. That's how we ended up on the East Coast. He was a professor at Penn State for most of his career. And he was in the College of Agriculture. And so he's a plant physiologist. He studies a plant ecologist. He studies kind of the ecology of fungus and kind of root systems and things like this. But a lot of the research he was doing was in the agricultural kind of realm. And so, that definitely influenced how I looked at the world, because that was a lot of the dinner table conversation we'd have. And there was a little bass pond out at the research fields where my dad, we called it the farm, where he did a lot of his research on corn and tomato plants and things like this. And so we go out there and fish, and we would often talk about his research. And so, that was a big influence. And then certainly the background in terms of Japanese American history generally, but in my family too, we do have that tied to agriculture here in California. And I still have cousins who farm nuts, almonds, as they call them in the Central Valley, almonds and walnuts. And so there is that tie there. And then, as a kid, I was kind of a nerd. And so all the books I read were primarily history books, so I didn't read much fiction, but the fiction I did read, and I think this was kind of derivative of the fact that we were born in California, me and my older brother, but then we were raised in Pennsylvania, but we always wanted to go back to California. So we had this romantic notion of what California was or could be. And and realistic or not, it was what it was. I fell in love with John Steinbeck. And so those were the novels that I could read as a kid.
Yeah.
And I guess that was more later teens that I got into Steinbeck. But, you read East of Eden and you just fall in love with the Salinas Valley.
Yeah.
You fall in love with Monterey County and that whole area. So yeah, when I came back after I actually right out of college, sorry, I'm meandering all over the place here.
All good.
But right out of college, I was thinking I wanted to go in the policy world. I guess I, like a lot of kids I grew up with in a university town, we were, most of us were children of academics. And so we had kind of this very kind of broad worldview. So for example, I probably have more friends from my high school in Pennsylvania here in the Bay Area now than I do back in my hometown. So we all kind of took off after high school, but, I was always attracted to doing big things, and so the policy world seemed like a great opportunity to do big things, have a great effect on a lot of things. So the foreign policy world kind of really, really attracted me out of college. So I spent a few years in Washington, D.C., both in graduate school and working kind of in that policy world. And as a result of that, I kind of got this view of what are the biggest problems to solve in the world other than, geopolitical conflict. But if you dive a little bit deeper there, what causes geopolitical conflict? And, you're going to end up on food and supply chain thing really, really, really quick.
Right.
And so when I came back to the Bay Area after being in Washington for a little bit, still having that spirit of, big macro problems that you want to solve, food and agriculture were definitely at the top of that list. And I can't point out a specific trigger there, but probably also influenced by the fact that, the things that we just talked about, the background with my family and whatever. But at that time, when I came back to the Bay Area, the venture capital world was kind of going through this metamorphosis where the clean tech bubble had just kind of popped. And there were all these investors who were looking at these funds, these giant funds that they had raised to invest in clean tech. And now there just wasn't anything to invest in worthwhile. And they were trying to pivot those funds, that capital, to another sector that made sense. And something immediately adjacent to clean tech is agriculture.
Yeah.
Like, here's this giant industry, oldest industry in the world, biggest industry in the world, hasn't been disrupted for a long time. Like, this is perfect. Let's divert this capital into agriculture and to food. And so I came back to this valley about 10 years ago when that was kind of really starting to bubble to the surface. And so it was just kind of the perfect storm where my personal interests were aligning with a major kind of trend that was emerging in the venture world and things that were going up here in tech. So I kind of got involved in that. I came back out here working for a big Japanese trading firm, Mitsubishi Corporation, and they kind of have their hands in all sorts of business lines. And so I got involved with the business group that was doing kind of food, ag, and retail. I kind of attached myself to them. And then shortly after that, I helped some friends start a platform called the Mixing Bowl, which is kind of this platform to connect innovators in food and ag. And then through some other things, met some co-founders. Were my first startup in ag called Harvestport. We kind of got that off the ground. And through that, as I think about my journey with food, I think my journey with food has as much to do with my journey with people and finding great stories as it has to do with anything else. Because as a kid, like if I were to credit myself with any one skill, I'm not really good at much, but if I were to credit myself with a talent, it would be I can sit down with anybody and have a good conversation with anybody.
Yeah.
And I love hearing their stories too. And so as a kid, like I told you, we kind of grew up away from my extended family. So anytime we were around my grandparents or aunts and uncles, cousins, whatever, that was a treat. I mean, I got to do that once a year. And as a kid, you savor those moments. And what I found, particularly with my grandparents, who they're my heroes. What I found with them in particular was the best stories came out around the dinner table. And I love their stories. I still love their stories. If there's one thing I miss about my grandparents the most, it's just sitting and talking with them and hearing their stories.
Yeah.
And so I saw food very early on as this like mechanism, this tool, this vehicle to unlock these really great stories from people. And I found very early on that breaking bread with people is the best way to get to know them. And so Harvestport, my first startup, still with this spirit of just loving people and their stories and having great conversations. I think the thing I took away from that, other than the learning how to build a digital product and learning about, the intricacies of taking a product to market and all these things. I tried to study the people in the industry and tried to learn about the people who were growing our food and the people who were moving our food and how that was done and the stories behind them and the struggles
Right.
that they had and all the different, human-based strata within the industry. And that's what really kind of interested me, if I'm being totally honest, which is maybe why that company failed. But anyway, so food for me has always been this, again, vehicle to kind of discover the best human stories, because this is the way that people open up. When you break bread with them, I mean, that's when they'll kind of open their soul to you. And so I just see it as this very, very powerful tool from that perspective.
I mean, for sure. I mean, I think I told you, I like to say that, food connects us all in some way. And then, when it does connect us, here we are sitting, talking to each other right now and, and doing this. And then let's get into, your mission to Japan before we jump forward to, your current work.
Sure.
Tell us about the mission to Japan and mission to Tokyo, Japan, and, how it affected you. And, I want to hear all the good food you had too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, so the mission, it's a 2-year experience that kind of all young men in my church are encouraged to do. And, we don't get to choose where we go. Oftentimes previous language training and cultural heritage do play a part, but, ultimately we don't choose where we go. But I was really blessed to end up in Tokyo. And I remember you get a letter from our church headquarters in Salt Lake City, and you get a letter that assigns you to your mission. And now it's all digital, but in those days it was, snail mail, get a letter. And I still remember the day I got that letter in April 2001. And my dad was out gardening, and I just I couldn't wait to open. I opened it and I saw Tokyo there, and I didn't even read the rest of the letter. I just started jumping up and down. But yeah, so that was
awesome.
2001. And you start out by going to a place called the Missionary Training Center, where you kind of try to learn the language, which, it's impossible to learn a language until you immerse yourself. But, I got to Japan September 4th, or I left September 4th, 2001. So I got there basically a week before 9/11. And, I was in Yokohama when 9/11 happened, brand new missionary. And as a missionary, your sole focus is on sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you're very, very focused on that. And so as a missionary, you don't watch the news, you don't read newspapers, you don't read magazines, you kind of take yourself out of the world, so to speak. And so we didn't have access to the radio or TV or anything in the apartment we were living in. And I just get this call because, again, the internet wasn't what it is today in those days, and information didn't move as efficiently as it does today. And so even the information that was available right after it happened in Japan wasn't totally accurate. I remember we were in the City Hall building. Everybody, foreign residents of Japan, have to get what's called a gaijin card and basically get it stamped in every locale that they live in. And so I was needing to do that. We were in the City Hall building and in Yokohama, and I remember the TV playing in the background, the news, and they had conflated a data point where I think the capacity of the World Trade Center was like 50,000 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think the National Guard had sent 50,000 body bags to Ground Zero, just in case kind of a thing. And they actually reported that as the number of deaths in this. So, information was just kind of all over the place.
Right.
But the morning of, I get a call from our mission office, and all they told me was Pennsylvania was bombed, the Pentagon was destroyed, and the World Trade Center was destroyed. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
And then the rumors started swirling in the mission very quickly that all the American missionaries are going to be sent home because they're instituting the draft and we're going to war.
Right.
And so as a young kid, you believe the rumors,
Whatever you hear. Yeah.
Anybody older than you in the mission you just look at them as like, oh yeah, these guys know everything.
Yeah.
So there was of course, that was a rumor and it was debunked very quickly. But for about 3 days there, before that was debunked, I was thinking,
going back.
I'm going back. I'm getting drafted. I'm going to war. This sucks. But anyway, that was the beginning of my mission. But it was the most beautiful 2 years of my life. I started out in Yokohama, and then we transferred around as missionaries. I was down in Shizuoka Prefecture in Hamamatsu, which is a beautiful coastal city down there. And then I spent most of my mission in Western Tokyo in a town called Hachioji, which is kind of Tokyo suburb. A lot of universities in the area, so a lot of young people, but it's not a super exciting place. But I loved it. And then I ended my mission in a town called Kichijoji, which is a little more happening place, a little cooler place, kind of place that if you tell a Tokyoite that you live there, they go, oh, cool. Hachioji is one of those places where people go, interesting. Yeah, never been there. But anyway, it was great. And as a missionary, you have a very small budget for living. So I wasn't eating incredible food, but I remember the first time I had, there's a chain of restaurants in Japan called Koko's Ichiban, which is a curry house. And they do like the katsu kare, so tonkatsu on top of curry rice. And growing up in Pennsylvania, I had never had that before. And I remember the first time I had that, I thought, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And then I remember on Oshogatsu, my first New Year's in Japan, we had a friend who cooked okonomiyaki for me. And that was the first time I'd ever had okonomiyaki. I'd never had it before. And I thought, what is this? This is amazing. This is brilliant. And the cool thing about okonomiyaki, that's one of those dishes that kind of came out of, it's this beautiful, savory, umami-packed kind of pancake, but it's garbage food. It came out of kind of, here's the ingredients we have, what can we do with them, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you find that, cuisines all over the world, there are these, and I use that term very lovingly, but there are all these like garbage foods that come out of the need to survive, and they've just found this way to create something incredibly delicious with so little, and this is what I'm talking about. Like if you're cooking just to survive, or if you find joy in the kitchen, that's the difference. And I think that's how some of these dishes, there was someone who finally found the joy of cooking, and they were able to take these very scarce resources and create something just so beautiful. But so as missionaries, because that chain was so abundant and also relatively cheap, we ate a lot of that. There was the typical, kind of beef bowl place, the Matsuya, Yoshinoya type format, just the
donburi kind of.
Yeah, the beef bowl stuff. We did a lot of that. And occasionally there was this old shokudo, just kind of typical cafeteria almost style little hole in the wall place near our church in Hachioji we used to go to all the time. And the typical place with a bunch of placards of different menu items on the wall, and there I would get either the yasai tame, which is just like the vegetable stir fry, or they had this shoga pork, ginger pork dish that it's just a little bit of pork, bowl of rice, bowl of miso, and it's perfect. And they also, at these little shokudo, you could get like just very simple shio broth ramen, no frills,
right?
And just the noodles, salt-based broth, and then a little piece of kamaboko or whatever on the side. No frills, negi chopped on top, and but just so clean, so good. Americans, we love tonkotsu ramen, really thick, really salty, and it's good. It's delicious. But sometimes just those more simple options just, it hits the spot.
Yeah.
But, and then we ate at a lot of, members of our church in Tokyo would feed us often. And so you get like the home cooking stuff a lot. And that was great. I think one of the biggest revelations I had though, on my mission in terms of food, we were, our main activity was, we'd talk to anybody on the street, at their doors, whatever. We'd do a lot of service, and we'd end up, anybody who was interested in our church, we'd talk to them. We'd often visit them in their homes or whatever. And there was this older gentleman that we became very, very good friends with when I lived in Hachioji, and he was turned out he was a very wealthy landowner in this area that he lived in. His family once owned like the whole thing, kind of a thing, and he had sold it off little by little as they developed it. And but he still had kind of a decent size tract of land for being in Tokyo, and he had a really impressive garden. He had these beautiful white peach trees; they're just gorgeous. And then he had a bunch of vegetables that he'd plant as well. But we were over at his house one day. It was the middle of the summer. It was really hot, and he had these white peaches ready to go, and those were delicious. And then he went back to his back stoop, and he had his little clay jar inside with the sake kasu, kasudoko, the pickling stuff, the sake leaves that you pickled. And he takes the jar out, brings it in, puts it on the counter, opens it up, reaches his hand in, pulls out a couple cucumbers, rinses them off, chops them up, puts them on a plate, and just puts it in front of it. And there was just something about, those pickles tasted like, they tasted like Kasuzuke pickles. But it was just watching that whole process of him going to the back stoop, getting the jar, opening the jar, sticking his hand in, getting his hand all dirty and getting the cucumber out, and it's covered in the kasudoko, and then he rinses it off and he chops it up. It's the most delicious, most refreshing. It was like 100 degrees outside, and that cold pickle is just so good.
And it's just watching that whole natural process.
So great. Yeah, so great.
That's awesome.
This same guy, he supported. This is how we found out he was super rich. We knew he owned an old folks home that we would do service in every week, and so we knew he had some means. But then we're over at his house, and he supported this orphanage in Sri Lanka, and we knew that too. But he had left out this paper check that he was going to send to them, and it was for $1.5 million. And it was just sitting on his coffee table.
Oh, jeez.
And I had to do the conversion because it's written in yen.
Right.
I'm like looking at, I looked at, we always work in twos, and my buddy that I was working with at the time, he was Japanese. And so I checked my math with him, and he's just staring at the check like, what? I'm like, am I saying?
Is that correct?
He's like, yeah. He's like, anyway, so you wrote this $1.5 million check for this orphanage in Sri Lanka. But anyway, wow, so cool. Interesting guy. But those pickles, oh my gosh, they're so good.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're describing some of the simpler dishes sometimes are the best.
Oh, yeah.
With less ingredients.
Oh, yeah.
And okonomiyaki's got, 3 or 4 ingredients, and then you can add whatever you want to it after that. Yeah. But, it's cabbage, flour, water.
Totally.
Salt, bonito.
Yep.
And then whatever else.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. And then, that takes us back. You're back home.
Yeah.
And, you talked about your process, your studying, and then you kind of told me that you ended up in Japantown, right? Eventually.
So still kind of following that policy bead. Like I was talking about before. So I, right out of college, I went to Washington. I did an internship with a think tank doing foreign policy stuff. And then I got a fellowship on Capitol Hill and worked with a couple legislators there. And that was the summer of 2007. That was an interesting summer. And that I was working on a specific bill that was a bill for reparations for Japanese Americans or Japanese of Latin American descent who were extradited from what was called the Panama Canal Zone during World War II, and they were brought into U.S. prison camps and used as prisoner exchange. But a lot of them stayed in the U.S. Anyway, long story short, that was sponsored by an organization called the Japanese American Citizens League, and the gentleman who was leading that organization at the time was from Utah, went to BYU, older gentleman, but he kind of took me under his wing, a gentleman by the name of Floyd Morey. And so after that first stint in Washington, I went to work for him at the JACL, and their headquarters is in San Francisco on Sutter, right there in Japantown. So that's how I ended up in Japantown. It wasn't, deliberately going to Japantown. I was working for the JACL. But, so I ran their membership programs and some development programs and youth programs for a couple of years prior to going back to graduate school.
Yeah.
There, so
nice.
Yeah.
And then, before we get into the company you're currently working for, just get into a little bit of food. There's some spots that you highlight, either East Coast or West Coast, that you had some really good experiences.
Yeah. So, I guess, and maybe this goes along with kind of like my romantic attachments to California and my obsession with John Steinbeck and the world that he portrayed in his books. I've always kind of been attracted to the past. And, I realize that this is perhaps completely unrealistic because the past has plenty of their ghosts in the closet and problems. But, I've always had this kind of romantic attachment to long time ago. And so that translates over into other things that I enjoy, like food. And so when I was in Washington, for instance, the first place I was doing an internship, that think tank, we would have monthly team lunches at Old Ebbitt's. And Old Ebbitt's Grill is an OG. They're no longer in their original location, but they're an OG kind of restaurant in Washington that my grandfather, my mom's dad, who grew up in Washington, D.C., I mean, he grew up going to that one, way back in 1920s, 1930s. Wow. And Old Ebbitt's is classic. You go there and it's a steakhouse where you go and you get shooters.
Okay.
And so it's just really old school kind of club, but I loved it. The ambiance, the booths, the just very old school. And then when I was my first stint in San Francisco, young bachelor living in the city, again, also attracted to kind of like these old school, places again that I could picture John Steinbeck walking into and not blushing, and so places like Tadich.
Yeah.
And Tadich, of course, I think their claim is oldest restaurant in California?
Pretty close, yeah. Definitely a classic for sure.
1854 or something like this. And it's not just the restaurant itself, because you get it as soon as you walk in. And in any restaurant that has a policy like no reservations, you know what I mean? Like that's something I'm like, I respect this. Like there's something about this restaurant that they can say that and still, maintain themselves, whatever. And then when you walk in, there's that bar, and then there's the booths on the left-hand side. And it's just, it just reeks of that era of California, and it's just great. And all the servers have, the aprons that go down to their ankles, and, the white jackets, and it's just classic. And you get butter in a dish. And I remember the first time I had cioppino at Tadich. I think that would have been 2008. Or 9, and it was a cold, rainy winter day, just classic, perfect weather for Tadich. And I remember that first time dipping my bread into the soup broth and taking a bite of that and just thinking, oh my gosh, this is it. Like you could taste the generations of Italian and Portuguese fishermen in the Bay Area and the Monterey Bay Area, and you could see all the salt in the wrinkles of their faces, and you could see their calloused hands, pulling up nets, and you could, just that whole experience. It was all in that one dish. And I remember thinking like, gosh, this dish is so powerful. There's so much history. There's so many stories in this one dish, and you look down at the dish and there's the dungy, and there's the halibut, and there's the, it's just, and there's the shellfish, it's just filled with all of this color and all these beautiful stories. So that Tadich is still one of my favorite places.
Yeah, no, definitely good call. I just looked it up for you. Tadich is the oldest continuously run restaurant in California and the third oldest in the United States.
There you go. Go. Well, I did a similar thing when I was interviewing for grad schools. Excuse me. I was out in Boston, and right there on the waterfront, there's the Union Oyster Bar, and that has the claim of the oldest restaurant in the United States.
Okay.
And since 1790 or something like this.
Wow.
I don't know. And the Oyster Bar, you sit at this bar, and it is the same, kind of butcher block slab countertop that has been there since the 1700s. And it's all worn, and there's like waves in it. And anyway, and I did a round of shooters at this bar. And also their claim is this is where the toothpick was invented.
Okay.
I don't know. But so I had my round of shooters, and it just in that ambiance, you know, there in Boston, like just made them that much sweeter and tasted so much better. And then I got a toothpick from their little toothpick thing below the sign that says where the toothpick was invented.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
I got that, and that was the best toothpick experience, you know. So I've always just been in search of that great story, you know, and these stories really color and augment all these experiences that I've had, but and certainly with food.
Yeah, and then we can get into a few more of them. I mean, we talked about we've got a few lists of them, but I kind of wanted to get into what you're currently doing now, and why don't you tell us kind of how you were just about to get into how you became the CEO of the company, and tell us all about Seisuke and
for sure.
It's got a lot of cool. I was looking at everything that's you guys offer, and I'll let you tell everybody what's going on.
Yeah, so I kind of fell backwards in the Seisuke. So as we've been talking about for the past decade, I've kind of been playing at that intersection of food and ag and tech and retail, and so that's kind of the network I've had. But the other half of my network has been the kind of that U.S. Japan side. So speaking Japanese, or I guess trying to speak Japanese these days, but I've always been part of that network, and I've interacted with a lot of different organizations on that side as well, and so I was kind of in between things last year, and my friend at World Innovation Lab, which is a Japanese venture capital firm here, they needed someone to build and run an accelerator program that they were running for Japanese companies. And so I ended up doing that, consulting with them for the better part of a year, building that and running that. And one of the companies that, unlike a lot of acceleration programs in the area, this one wasn't necessarily focused on just tech companies. It was just focused on Japanese companies. Mm-hmm. And one of the companies that was in that program was Seisuke Knife. And when I first saw them, I kind of thought, how do they fit? I'm not really sure. And the more I got to know the founder, Hiro, the more I was like, wow, this is a great story. Again, I'm keying in on a story, right?
Yeah.
Because the story there is Hiro, his background, he's kind of all over the place too, but he went to school as a designer and kind of computer science background. And at the kind of the front end of the e-com revolution, early, late 2000s, he joined a company in Hawaii, a Japanese company that was selling kind of like Hawaiian traditional folk goods back into Japan. Okay. And they built that. It did pretty well. But after that experience, he thought, I want to do this with Japanese stuff, right? So he went back to Japan. He's from a place called Ishikawa, which is on the Sea of Japan side. And it's close to an area that is known for steel and blade making.
Bladesmiths, yeah.
And he saw these knives, and he didn't know anything about knives at the time, and they were just so beautiful. They spoke to him, and he asked one of the makers. He said, "Could I try to sell some of your knives online?" And the guy said, he didn't. This is back 2008, 2009 or whatever. He didn't really know what that meant, and he's open to it, like, yeah, sure, give it your best shot, And he looked at the prices of the knives, and he's like, "Ooh, these are expensive, so I can't buy these knives." So he said, "Could I just take some pictures of your knives, and then I'll try to sell some online?" The guy said, "Yeah." And so a couple of weeks later, he comes back and said, "I sold a bunch of your knives," without having any inventory or any guaranteed access to them. But anyway, so that started the journey of Seisuke Knife, and I think he officially incorporated the company back in 2014. Anyway, but I just kind of fell in love with the story, and obviously the product speaks for itself. And I think there's a lot in kind of that U.S. Japan consumer world where a lot of stuff that Americans think is cool about Japan, Japanese people think is dumb. And a lot of stuff that Japanese people think will work in the U.S. market will never work.
Doesn't, yeah.
But knives and these kind of crafts goods it is in that kind of, it will work in both worlds kind of realm. And they just kind of speak for themselves. The stories of the craftsmen is just beautiful. Some of these makers, Sakai Takayuki, which represents a bunch of different makers, but they've been in business for 600 years, and
Wow.
a lot of these guys are part of these schools that were making katana back in the day for, samurai and whatever. So, the story there is really cool. And then beyond that, the chefs and the artisans that now use these blades are just, it's just another layer of really deep and rich stories to pile onto that. So it was just a beautiful story. And I would meet with all these companies, one-on-one to kind of help advise and mentor or whatever. Every time I met with Hiro, it was less of a kind of an advisory interaction, more of like, how can I get involved?
Right. Yeah.
And that kind of just evolved naturally into that conversation of, yeah, well, why don't you run the kind of the US side of the business kind of a thing? And so that's where we ended up. And I joined in April, so it's still relatively new. But the structure of the company is, typical of a lot of retailers, where we source a lot of different brands. And then we have kind of our own line of knives as well, Seisuke knives. And those are basically aggregated from these makers in Japan that don't have their own brands. And so we buy them from them and brand them. But like I said, a lot of these makers, some of these houses have been doing it for generations. And, certainly they've been, they are employing this same techniques that, these sword makers were, 500 years ago. So it's just a beautiful kind of timeless art. And the other thing that attracted me about the business after having worked with tech products for a while is, here's something that people will pay a fair market price for. When they get it, it works. It does what it says it does.
Right.
They love it, and it lasts forever.
Yeah.
And there's something very beautiful, just from a commercial perspective, very beautiful about that I think we've kind of departed from a little bit in the kind of the sea of tech products that kind of work sometimes. Sometimes they're magical, and sometimes they just don't really perform, or sometimes they're overbuilt, or whatever. And
They
sometimes
get used for a couple of years, and then that's it.
Yeah, that kind of a thing, right? But here's something that's kind of timeless. It's beautiful. It's high end, but people don't complain about the price because they understand what it is, kind of a thing, right? So
yeah, the craftsmanship that goes into it.
Exactly.
And, for the most part, it's hand done, and
exactly.
You see the, just diving into some of the, I was diving into some of the makers. I mean, you've got over 10 different bladesmiths that you guys offer, and they're from, a big portion of them are from the main section where a lot of bladesmiths come from.
Yeah, we work a lot with the makers from what's called from the Echizen region, which historically was a major port city in Japan. It's not anymore, but it's a big crafts. So it's also known for traditional washi paper and some of the ceramics and stuff like this. But we work with a lot of the knife makers out of there. Yu Kurosaki, who you met, comes out of that area. And they have a little bit, it's called the Takefu Knife Village. And so there's a handful of makers that operate out of there. But just really beautiful guys, really colorful guys. And their products are just, they speak for themselves.
Yeah, I was reading like Katsushige Unru.
Mm-hmm.
He says iron is alive.
There you go.
That's kind of his motto with it.
Yep.
Is that, you get it, and he's 4th generation bladesmith, and his story goes back to the 1870s. It says, and he's like, you use it and it becomes alive, and I've made it for you, and and it's been awesome. Yeah,
and a lot of that, I love that quote. Japanese steel, it is alive. It's very dynamic, and I think a lot of people will be surprised at how delicate and thin, particularly Kurosaki. He's known for his very delicate, very, very thin blades. And so their responsiveness is just, it's out of this world. And they're really fun to use. Again, finding that joy in the kitchen. When you use a sharp knife, when you use any good tool in the kitchen, it does make a difference. Whether or not that's placebo, the effect of it is real. It just kind of gives you that feedback kind of that dopamine feedback where you're like, oh, wow, this is awesome.
Yeah.
You know, this is great. This is fun. You know, when you cut through a root vegetable or something where you're used to kind of more resistance with a lesser knife, you use one of our knives, and you know, it's like cutting through butter, and that elicits an emotive response that translates, I think, into the production of the food itself. But
yeah, and for those that you don't know, I went to this event in Japantown that Tim ran, and it put together we kind of had a little bit of everything put together. We had it at the community center, Japanese cultural center in Japantown in San Francisco. And we had Seisuke Knife, and then we brought together a bunch of different folks. We had Den Sake, who's a small batch sake maker in Oakland. And then you had Trifecta Cooks. You had Mac Barbecue.
Yep.
And then you had Trex, who sponsored, bringing in Australian Wagyu. And I think we had some A5 Wagyu as well.
Yep.
We had Velarde Foods with black truffle. And I'm kind of going off with everybody, but you had Chef 2 brought his photo broth.
Oh man, it was an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, Spice Tribe, of course, supporting all of that. It just kind of, and then we got to see Yu Kurosaki with his knives, and see them up close and personal. And then the folks that were attending the event got to purchase them. And they flew off the shelf. I mean, I saw multiple people with multiple knives, and there was a lot of chefs there from their own restaurants that own restaurants. And purchase them. And if you guys don't know, Yu Kurosaki has the title of Japan's youngest master blacksmith, bladesmith.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is really difficult to hold that title.
Yep.
Most knife makers are another 20 years on them before they get that title.
Yeah. Yeah, that event in San Francisco was really nice to see. We had never done anything in San Francisco before as a company, and I'm still relatively new to the company. And like you said, we sold a bunch of knives that night, and there was one gentleman in particular. He'd been waiting for about 3 years for a debo, which is a knife that's used for breaking down fish particularly. And it's a type of knife that Kurosaki doesn't make very often. So this guy had been waiting for a long time. When he was able to purchase, he actually got misty-eyed. He started tearing up. He was so emotional. And I, at first my reaction to that was like, that's a little bit overdone. But then I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. That's very cool. That was a huge validation point for me personally. Like, yeah, people love these knives, and people are it's like buying art. Yeah. To a certain extent. But yeah, that night was great. And everybody in the kitchen just killed it, to your point. Yeah. The Trifecta and Mac, and we had Michelin star chefs at that event, and they were gobbling that food up,
for sure.
It was great. And, the thing is, any of that food that we had there that night, I would feel very comfortable putting on a menu in a high-end dining room, and it would do just fine. And those guys put their heart and soul into what they cook. And, again, it's the best story wins, and that plays out in the food and the plate, So between Chef 2 and the crew we had in the kitchen, and Kurosaki and all the other vendors and partners that were there. I mean, again, going back to this idea of the best story, I mean, there's so many good stories there. We had my friend that I also help advise, Natsumi, who runs a juice business, Shikoasa Juice.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okinawan. It's kind of like yuzu, calamansi, kind of like, it
was very good.
Oh, it's really good. But her story is incredible too. Her family is the largest producer and juicer of this fruit in Okinawa. It goes back generations. And, that story is just unbelievable. It's incredible. That fruit is critical to the blue zone of Okinawa, kind of this longevity kind of thing in Okinawa. It's one of the superfoods that they rely on. And anyway, just so many, the Spice Tribe stories, and then Chef 2's story. I mean, talk about a beautiful story. It's, and you feel anything that Chef 2 touches in the kitchen. I mean, he tells the story, but you can't help but feel that story and taste that story as you're eating it. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, finding that joy and finding that story in the food, in the kitchen, it all becomes part of this one contiguous kind of experience that I don't know. It's hard to describe, but it's just this sensory kind of experience that kind of envelops all of it. Whereas when that stuff is absent from it, it takes away from the singular experience of just eating the food kind of a thing, right?
Right.
But once you contextualize it and all of that richness, like, oh my goodness, the food.
It's kind of
so
the
good.
full, I guess you could say the full circle, full experience is what you're getting. You
Absolutely.
know?
Yeah.
Culture, all attached to it, who made it, you know, where it's from.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I
putting
wanted
it all together.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to do that event in Japantown too, because I mean, I talked about this a little bit that night, but you know, we look at Japantowns and Chinatowns now as outsiders, as kind of fun places to visit. But you know, these places were created as places to live and places to survive, and the immigrant community experience in this country is such, and basically everybody in this country has been touched by that immigrant experience at some generation of their family. I mean, we all have. Some have had a harder time than others, but we've all kind of had that somewhere in our family. And when you're in that kind of context, you're left with very little to celebrate sometimes. And it's, you know, life is very, very hard. And so what do you have left to celebrate other than family and faith and food, you know? And those are the main things. So food becomes one of the main ways to enjoy life, to take joy, to be grateful, and to tell stories and to pass those stories on. Again, it's little Tim sitting at the dinner table with his grandparents over dinner, you know, and listening to their stories, and that being the means by which to access those stories, you know.
Yeah.
I love that.
I mean, it hit home for me because I spent, you know, years growing up. I'm half Japanese as well, as you know, and my mom took us to Japantown all the time. And I know she spent hours at the cultural center and doing activities with whatever it is they were doing, you know, and all me being back there was a treat because it's, again, connecting with everyone and, you know, new friends out of it. And that's exactly what she would have wanted.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, and then going into the company, is there, you've got to have some favorite things that you like out of there, or you got some
on a product basis?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to pick. There is a huge selection because you don't just have knives. You guys have cookware. You guys have small tools. You have peelers. You have, you even got books. You have, I saw that you had Sonoko Sakai's Japanese home cooking book.
Talk about a beautiful person,
right?
Yeah, we hope to host Sonoko sometime. If she's listening to this, please come to the store in Portland.
Yeah, we'll get it out to her.
Yeah, there you go.
Same here.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the products, I mean, obviously we do sell other things than knives. The knives are the main thing, obviously.
Yeah.
I am partial to Kurosaki. I do love his knives. He has a series, the Kurouchi series, which is, you know, I kind of like, a lot of his knives are the polished steel.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of like that kind of raw, high carbon kind of matte look on some of the blades.
A little bit of patina.
Yeah, I kind of like that sometimes. You know, for me, you know, again, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but for me, you know, the greatest part about the company for me is just working with the people.
Yeah.
And we've got a great team in Portland, and you know, we were talking about this a little bit before, but they're young and they're alive, and they're just good people.
Yeah.
And that's something I take a lot of pride in is just helping people kind of find their own stories and be proud of them and develop them, and we've got some great stories in the people that work for Seisuke. So that's my favorite thing about the company. But yeah, Kurosaki is, you know, no offense to any of the other makers, but he is, by far my favorite maker in the portfolio.
Yeah, and I mean, you even carry his brothers. He has an older brother.
Yeah,
and,
Makoto. Yeah, and I've never met Makoto, and you know, I've asked you if there's any competition between them. He's like, no. But yeah, Makoto's knives, they're totally unique as well.
Yeah.
He does a lot of interesting handle styles, and so he's kind of his own guy. You know, we have our own line, the Seisuke line, which I'm trying to promote more, which are you know, they're exciting because they're fairly scalable with the same general quality.
Yeah.
But a little bit lower price point on average. But they're great knives. And we're honored to be able to tell the stories of their makers, because these are makers that don't have their own brands.
Right.
And so it's really an honor to kind of put the Seisuke name on their craftsmanship. So those are also favorites. Yeah, but I'm definitely pretty traditional in terms of I like the Japanese handled knives over the Western handled knives, and although they're a little higher maintenance, the high carbon, kind of non-stainless blades are kind of fun.
Yeah.
And you got to kind of put that TLC into them to keep them from rusting, keep them from corroding and breaking down. So, but yeah, it's still, I'm still on the learning curve, lots to learn and to love about the product line. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, closing thoughts, any advice you want to give, anything you guys have coming up? Maybe there's some events coming up. I know this podcast probably won't come out for a few months because I'm stacked up with what's coming out, but tell us what you got going on, and any advice. And I know you're an entrepreneur as well. If you want to shout out some advice,
go
ahead. Floor is yours.
Nice, boy.
Floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it really, as cliche as it sounds, I've always been about building the best team, and kind of what's that old song? If you can't, love the one you're with, or whatever. Anyway, trying to build the best team, and then whatever team that you've been given, trying to make it the best possible. And so for me, it's always about building community and ensuring that the team is as cohesive and is set out with life as much as possible. So that's why I love building partnerships with folks. I think as an entrepreneur, as a former founder, the only advice I would have for people is to don't ever fall into the trap of thinking you can do it alone. Sometimes as a founder, like that's what the world makes you think is honorable and respectable, is like, oh, I did this all myself, but you're gonna put the weight of the world on your shoulders for no good reason. And so find good partners and rely on them, and don't think you have to do everything on your own. And if you fail, don't sweat it. Get back up, keep going. Obviously try not to fail, because it's not fun. But yeah, that'd be my very cliche advice on that side of things. But closing thoughts on the company and stuff coming up. Kurosaki, we're going to try to make this an annual affair next year, try to blow it out a little bit bigger, try to hit LA next year, and Seattle.
Yeah. Nice.
I think LA, there's a lot of pent up energy down there that we want to tap into, and already starting to talk to some folks down there. So, but nothing huge, but check out the store, Seisuke Knife, seisukeknife.com. We're going through a big redesign of the website right now, and kind of minor rebrand. And so that stuff won't be ready for another few months, but check out the store, seisukeknife.com. See if there's anything you like. We got a sale going on right now, which will be over by the time this is launched, but there will probably be another sale going on.
Yeah. And you guys are on Instagram as well.
Yep.
And I'll put all that in the show notes. Thanks, Tim.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you coming on, and thanks for listening, everybody. We're out. And as a quick reminder, the restaurants and gear talked about on each episode can be found on my website, foodoriginspodcast.com. I appreciate your support, and thanks for listening.